Tonight, we're diving headfirst into a world where honor is lethal, routines are torture, and bathing might just be your worst nightmare. Welcome to an age where tradition doesn't just guide you, it shackles your soul. This is not just history. This is survival dressed in silk and soaked in blood. Welcome to the hard-edged, highly disciplined, and coldly poetic realm of ancient Nobuharan Empire, built on order, obedience, and sharp-edged consequences. This wasn't just a land of falling blossoms and flute music. No, here, you either lived by the code or were buried beneath it. Think cherry trees, yes, but also think calligraphy written in sweat and fear. If you're planning to sit back and relax, hit that follow or subscribe the channel button, only if you're into stories that slap harder than a samurai's backhand. And while you're at it, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is. We love knowing who's wide awake with us across the world. Now dim those lights, crank up a little ambient wind or rain if you're fancy like that, and brace yourself, we're entering the past, and it's not gentle. In ancient Nobuhara, you didn't get to pick your dream job. You didn't discover your passion. You were born into a role carved into your family tree 6 generations ago. And that role wasn't a career. It was a life sentence with props, uniforms, and daily humiliation. Born into a warrior clan? Great. You now serve the blade, the bow, and a soul-crushing etiquette handbook the size of a small ox. A rice farmer? Enjoy 40 years of being one with the mud. And guess what? Your children will too. Forever. No CV. No Etsy shop. No freelancing. You were either a blade swinger, dirt digger, artisan, or coin counter. Picked your lane? Too bad. It's concrete, and you're nailed to it. Climbing the social ladder? That's cute. In Nobuhara, you don't climb, you kneel. Ambition isn't dangerous. It's illegal. And we haven't even talked about the Numa, the untouchables. These are the ones who deal with the unclean jobs. Butchering animals, executing criminals, tanning leather. The society needs them, but also pretends they're invisible. Picture ghosts with full-time gigs. Required, but repulsive. Even within the social classes, things were complicated. Take the merchants, for example. You'd think, money, nice robes, good life? Nope. In Nobuhara, making money without bleeding for it was seen as morally corrupt. You're basically evil for being good at business. Meanwhile, the peasants who literally fed the nation were squeezed so hard by rice taxes that if they gave too much, they starved. But if they tried to hold some back, treason and execution. Often in front of neighbors. Now let's check in with our sword-polishing aristocrats, the Kyokai, the warrior caste. Yes, you've got honor, but you're also living every moment one mistake away from disgrace. Sneeze wrong in front of your general? Shame. Wrinkle in your robe? Disrespect. Slight body odor during a ceremonial bow? Social execution. And ladies? Oh, you thought maybe being female spared you from this circus of oppression? Think again. Doesn't matter your class, your freedom ends where your father's eyebrows begin. You'll marry who you're told. Obey everyone ranked above your sandals. And if you're truly blessed by the gods, maybe you'll get to write a haiku before bed. So you're born. You're assigned a costume, given a script, and shoved onto society's stage whether you want to perform or not. It's poetic, yes, but more like poetry written on shackles. And all of this before your first meal. And let's talk about hygiene, because in Nobuhara, being clean wasn't optional. It was practically sacred. Beautiful? Sure, but also brutal. Your morning didn't start with a hot shower and bath bombs. It began at a stone basin with freezing water scooped from a creek. Your ancestors may or may not be laughing from the afterlife as you splash your face and arms, shivering like a fish at a sushi stall. Soap? Only if you're wealthy. And even then, it smelled like disappointment and crushed rice husks. In the countryside, the bathhouse was the epicenter of cleansing and gossip. Heated by firewood, packed with local sand privacy, zero. You're scrubbing your unmentionables beside your neighbor, your landlord, and possibly your future father-in-law. And it's dead silent, because talking while naked was apparently rude. You clean first, then soak. Dirty the water and you're done. Socially, forever. If there's no bathhouse, you make do with a twig for a toothbrush and salt for toothpaste. You keep your clothes aired, your nails neat, and your dignity balanced precariously on your scent. If you're a kyokai warrior, triple the pressure. Your general might inspect your armpits mid-meeting. Unclean fingernails? Dishonor. Wrinkled clothing? Insult. Smell funky during a bow? Your next outfit is a burial robe. Women? Expected to smell like cherry blossoms and discipline. Hair? Maintained in styles so complicated they should come with a user manual and support group. Why? Because even if you're pounding rice or scraping fish guts, you better look graceful doing it. So yes, Nobuhara was clean, painfully clean, freezing water, endless grooming, and the unrelenting feeling that someone, somewhere, was silently judging your toe hygiene. You don't just get a slap on the wrist here, you get a full-on, candle-lit public lesson in why you never so much as breathe near Lord Kenzo's ceremonial pickle tea. The tea isn't about Tay-State's theater, restraint, and pretending you're not afraid of porcelain cups. In fact, every meal in the empire of Nobuhara is more about posture and poetic gloom than flavor. Think sacred rituals, with side dishes that crunch ominously, and may or may not be fish. And complaining? Only if you want your next meal served with a side of regret and a front row seat to your own public shaming. So you've just polished off a bowl of mystery broth that might have had eyes, and someone says something idiotic. Maybe Lord Kenzo mutters a haiku that sounds like a frog falling into a drum. Maybe old Riku claims his cow can forecast rainfall, and just for a second, you think about correcting them. Don't toupees. In Nobuhara, opinions are liabilities. The idea of freedom of speech is as fictional as a happy marriage between rival clans. Say the wrong thing, and you don't just offend someone, you rewrite your own obituary. Social ranks are carved in stone, and every syllable is a potential landmine. Speak out of turn? Disrespect. Mock someone above you? Insolence. Tell a bad joke? Treason adjacent. Even inside your home, the tension walks in first. Sons don't interrupt fathers. Wives don't correct husbands. And absolutely no one questions the warlord unless they've always been curious about what their intestines look like. The Kenzoku warriors the empire's elite train not just in bladecraft, but in verbal diplomacy so careful it borders on hypnotic. Anger is whispered, rage is swallowed. A reckless tongue is more dangerous than a dull sword because a sword cuts the flesh, but a word can cut the clan. And if you shame someone powerful, congratulations, you've forced them into the awkward position of needing to murder you for honor's sake. That brings us to the art of apologizing. In Nobuhara, sorry isn't a word, it's a spiritual performance. You bow, you grovel. You write verse about your shame using metaphors involving cranes and winter wind. You might even send an apology gift, a caged bird, a hair comb, a handmade moon lantern, hoping it won't be interpreted as sarcastic. Because here, even tone is a weapon. A misplaced inflection can be taken as rebellion, mockery, or emotional decay. Silence, often the safest bet. Even laughter's a gamble. Laugh at something wrong, disrespect. Laugh with someone powerful, presumption. That's how people end up reassigned to frozen fog duty in the desolate north. So yes, you're technically allowed to speak, but in practice, you nod, you smile, and you pray that your tongue never betrays you. Because here, loose lips don't just sink ships, they sink families. Now let's talk about fashion. You thought it was about expression? Not even close. In Nobuhara, your clothes are walking billboards for your social rank. Sleeves speak, colors whisper status. Fabric declares whether you're a warrior or just really good at cleaning someone else's sandals. Samurai wear layered silk, armor accents, and a stare that says, I've ended lives for less than a crooked hemline. Their colors? Deep navy, forest browns, the occasional red tones that say formal elegance with a hint of bloodstain. And the swords of them, the paired heirloom blades called Shinzo Quarant accessories. They're walking declarations of lethal authority. Worn wrong? You'll be corrected. Sharply. Now, shift your eyes to the peasant class. Cotton and practicality dominate. Colors? Earth tones, brown, gray, and mud after rain. Not by choice, because dyed fabric costs coin, and you're too busy not starving to think about coordinating your look. Your clothes say, yes, I work with dirt. No, I don't have other sandals. Merchants, despite their wealth, wear their prosperity like it's a secret. Silk? Maybe. But nothing flashy enough to trigger a bored swordsman into a spontaneous fashion critique. Wealthy traders master the art of looking successful, just enough to not get stabbed. Craftsmen and artisans, durable fabrics, modest cuts, colors that blend into the wall. Drawing attention to yourself is a design flaw. And womeno, the balancing act, graceful yet silent, obedient yet elegant, often wrapped in 12 layers of folded symbolism, with hairstyles engineered like architectural wonders. Kimono patterns are seasonal, meaning if you wear a spring design during a harvest ritual, you've just cursed your entire bloodline and fueled 5 days of neighborhood gossip. So no, your outfit isn't a choice, it's a coded survival suit, stitched with rules and embroidered with shame potential. Thinking about romance? Picture this. Moonlit cherry blossoms, whispered verses, a stolen kiss beneath paper lanterns. Forget it. In Nobuhara, love is an inconvenience tucked in between arranged marriages and rice taxes. Marriage isn't a union of souls, it's a trade agreement. If you're a villager, your parents and probably the village matchmaker who smells like old tea will choose your spouse. Emotional compatibility? Not a priority. Sturdy legs, healthy teeth, good rice yield? Much more important. If you're a warrior, marriage is even more political. You're marrying into power, territory, or to cancel out a 4 generations old insult. The goal isn't love, it's peace. Preferably the kind that survives winter. Romantic gestures exist, but they're low-key. Maybe a love letter, written in calligraphy that took 4 hours and passed secretly through a nosy servant who definitely knows too much. For women, choice is rare. A young lady from a samurai household may be married off at 15, trained in etiquette, ink painting, and the ancient art of saying absolutely nothing disappointing. Her duties? Brew tea, bear heirs, and definitely never fall in love with her poetry tutor. Love the messy, tearful, heart-thudding kindexists mostly in plays, legends, and haunting flute solos. If you wanted a love story, you'd better enjoy ghost tales about lovers who turn into fog. And stepping outside the arranged match? Dangerous. Adultery might earn you exile, disgrace, or a family resolution involving blades. The punishment might come from your spouse, your father, or your lord, whoever gets to you first. Even concubines common among samurai didn't make things easier. They just added more people to disappoint in silence. So yes, people fell in love, but always secretly, painfully, and at the worst possible time. Because in Nobuhara, love isn't illegal. It's just fatally inconvenient. Death, on the other hand, constant companion. It's your coworker, your travel buddy, the guy at your table who never speaks but always eats first. In this empire, people don't retire. They exit dramatically. Take the Kenzoku warriors. These aren't just fighters. They're walking contracts with mortality. Lose a battle? Time for Tsujime ritual suicide. Insult your honor? Tsujime. Spill sake on your lord's robe? Tsujime. With drums and witnesses. It's not secret. It's ceremonial, precision, poetry, and a whole lot of bleeding. And no, farmers don't get a pass. If the rice yield fails, you starve. If your village misses its quota, your head might be displayed as a motivational message. Drought, disease, raiders, it's a smorgasbord of horrible ends. And your medicine? Mostly hot water, herbal prayers, and relentless optimism. Bandits? Everywhere. They don't care that you spent 6 months growing those prized radishes. Roads outside town are death lotteries. Maybe we'll visit your cousin next spring. Translates to, I value my limbs. If you're a woman, childbirth is a gamble. Complications? Tough luck. Midwives can help, but surgery options include oil another rag and pray louder. If your husband dies in shame, tradition may expect you to join him, not emotionally, physically, with a blade. And the land itself? Earthquakes, floods, storms. Japan is a wrathful artist. Your house can disappear overnight. Insurance? That's called a solid roof and emotional detachment. But perhaps the most brutal part? You're expected to embrace it. Crying, begging, resisting those are for cowards. A true citizen of Nobuhara meets death with a bow, a poem, and the serenity of someone who's done this 1,000 times in dreams. So yes, the empire is stunning. But death isn't the end here, it's just part of the set design. Modern life tells you to find yourself, to chase dreams, to live out your truth. In Nobuhara, your truth is already written in ink, approved by elders, and sealed by your clan. You are not a free soul. You are a dot on a family scroll, important but replaceable. Even the highest Kenzoku doesn't fight for himself. He fights for his lord, for his house, for the memory of his grandfather's grandfather. And when he dies, hopefully it's in a way that makes the people above him look even more honorable. Slightly embarrass your family name in Nobuhara? Congratulations, you've just given your entire bloodline generational anxiety. Your choices don't just reflect on you, they echo backward in time and forward across provinces. Your father's dignity is tied to your conduct. Your grandfather's reputation still affects how your cousin gets treated in another city. It's not guilt by association, it's existence by entanglement. Want to open a dumpling cart because you love cooking? That's adorable. But know your family raises war horses, which means you'll be brushing muddy hooves and catching kicks until further notice. Show interest in painting? Great. You can paint murals for the family shrine under strict supervision, no artistic license, and absolute silence. And don't even dream of scandal. A single slipo-drunken haiku, an impulsive flirtation, a sarcastic poem at a festival land, the fallout isn't personal. It's familial. Your siblings get shunned. Your mother pretends you were adopted. Your great uncle may have to ritualistically fall on a decorative blade just to restore the family's standing. You're not a person, you're a symbolic liability wrapped in ceremonial robes. But hey, if you bow correctly, obey the matchmaker, and keep your thoughts tastefully boring, your clan might one day say your name with minimal shame, which, in this world, is the emotional equivalent of a gold star. Survived the social landmines? Great. Now try surviving the sky. Nobuhara is a visual masterpiece's now-capped peaks, whispering forests, delicate blossoms floating on ponds, and an absolute environmental horror show. The scenery is breathtaking. The climate? Actively homicidal. Start with the typhoon's massive tempests that tear through the land like vengeful gods with boundary issues. Your thatched roof? Gone. The rice you planted all spring? Now leisurely drifting downriver like it's on vacation. Then there are earthquakes, no warnings, no mercy. 1 second you're sipping broth, the next you're in your neighbor's house via the wall. Survived the shake? Congratulations, now dodge the fires. Everything's built from wood, including your worst decisions. One tipped brazier, and your entire neighborhood becomes a lesson in humility. Floods? Of course. A few days of hard rain, and suddenly your village is a soup. Animals disappear. Food spoils. Your landlord still demands taxes now with emotional interest. Don't like floods? Try drought. The sun bakes the fields until they're cracked open like roasted chestnuts. Water becomes sacred. The neighbor's well, suddenly guarded like a warlord's treasury. And winter? It's not charming. It's bone-deep cold with a side of shared misery. No central heating, just communal clay heaters and frostbite you pretend is spiritual enlightenment. Oh, and let's not forget the volcanoes. Yes, Nobuhara sits in the ring of fire. Sounds majestic. Feels like doom. One eruption, and your house becomes a fond memory beneath 20 feet of flaming regret. There's no disaster aid, no relief fund. If your home collapses, you build another. If your food's ruined, you go hungry. If your lord's estate is ruined too, you still owe taxes. Because here, catastrophe is not an excuse, it's an unpaid invoice from nature. In Nobuhara, the only thing that flows more freely than rivers is responsibility, and it flows downhill. You're never the top of the food chain. Someone always outranks you. You're a farmer? Your life is managed by the village elder, who reports to the local swordsman, who obeys the provincial lord, who answers to the shogun, who technically listens to the emperor, who exists more like a well-dressed ghost haunting the capital. Even the warrior class the tokomard at the top. They serve their daimyos, wait for orders, and die in battles they didn't pick over land they'll never own. Glory? In theory. In reality, they're just really well-armed middle management with performance reviews written in blood. Think the daimyos have it good? Only until they become too powerful. Then the shogun starts randomly inspecting their letters, their castles, and their necks. Too ambitious? Suddenly their heads are ceremonially removed from their strategic plans. And the shogun himself, the supreme warlord, he rules the country and sleeps with one eye open. Between clan politics, the economy, and 4 cousins trying to poison his jasmine tea, even power feels like a punishment. Then there's the emperor, officially outranks everyone. In reality, mostly recites poetry, blesses rituals, and contemplates how broke he is while wearing golden robes. He's like a divine paperweight. You can't ignore him, but you also can't ask him for help moving furniture. This ladder isn't made for climbing. It's made for standing still. You don't rise, you're assigned a branch like an ornamental tree and expected to remain beautifully motionless. Ambition is dangerous. Respect flows upward. Orders drop like heavy rain, and questioning anything. That's not bold, that's suicidal. Informal wear. Wherever you sit, farmer, merchant, swordsman, lord, someone controls your destiny, and someone's always hoping you trip. Now, let's talk about education, assuming you're lucky enough to see a scroll in your lifetime. Because what you learn in Nobuhara depends entirely on your place on the hierarchy. Spoiler, if you're near the bottom, learning involves mud and repetition, not ink and enlightenment. The Tokuma class, their children are born into books, bows, and burdens. From early childhood, they're drilled in writing, swordplay, etiquette, horseback riding, poetic suffering, and by age 14, how to compose a flawless death poem. You were still learning cursive. They were learning how to die eloquently. They study ancient texts, philosophy, war strategies, and the precise geometry of bowing. One angle too sharp, and the ancestors cringe. Too flat, and it's offensive. It's education, but with a side of anxiety. Merchants and artisans get a practical version, just enough to manage ledgers, calculate taxes, and not embarrass themselves in front of customers. You won't be reading Confucius, but you'll know exactly how many dried turnips equal 1 silk thread. Now the peasants, here's their curriculum. This is a hoe. This is rice. Now start working. Literacy, a pipe dream. Schooling, a luxury you don't have time for. You learn to survive, to work, to bow, and to do it all while being taxed into oblivion. The only scroll you'll see is nailed to a tree, explaining why your tax just went up again. Girls, unless you're born into prestige, you don't get education, you get training. In etiquette, needlework, tea ceremony, silence. You might learn poetry or calligraphy, but only if it doesn't interfere with your lifelong duty of folding laundry with emotional grace. Education here isn't about self-discovery. It's about self-erasure. You're taught what keeps the system moving, not what makes your soul sing. Learning for fun? That's a one-way ticket to being labeled eccentric and uninvited from the Moon Festival. Still romanticizing it? Let's talk about culture. Yes, Nobuhara is stunning. Every object, gesture, and blossom feels like it belongs in a museum. But here's the twist. The aesthetics come with expectations so strict they could cause spontaneous shame attacks. Everything is symbolic. Everything is judged. Flower arranging? You better follow a centuries-old formula. One blossom out of place, and suddenly your neighbors are whispering about your family's chaotic spirit. Tea ceremony, supposed to be peaceful. In reality, it's a pressure cooker of posture, precision, and the terrifying possibility of turning your teacup wrong. You bow, turn, sip, and silently hope no one noticed your emotional breakdown while sniffing the steam. Calligraphy? Not just handwriting, it's a test of discipline. That brushstroke? It's your soul on paper. Sloppy ink? You might as well tattoo unstable and unrefined on your forehead. Poetry? A minefield. You have to reference nature, your feelings, and the correct season without sounding too emotional, too dry, or too clever. Fail, and you're labeled a drama addict or a cold fish. Cultural refinement here isn't leisure, it's survival. You perform grace or get exiled from elegance. Everything beautiful is judged. Everything expressive is political. The arts don't relax you, they test you. Because in Nobuhara, beauty is a battlefield, and your bonsai is watching. After all, we've seen the hierarchy, the hardship, the hygiene, and the haiku shoot never last a full day in this world. Not because you're weak, not because you're spoiled, but because this society wasn't designed for freedom. It was built for structure, submission, and the kind of quiet, elegant suffering that makes you question whether blinking too loudly might be offensive. In Nobuhara, every moment is a silent exam. Every action is graded. Every word is measured. Every bow is judged. And one misstep could echo for generations. So, still wish you were born in the samurai age? If you're loving the ride through this razor-edged world, don't forget to follow or subscribe the channel for more vivid, dangerous dives into history's most disciplined nightmares. In Nobuhara, failure didn't come with a wrist slap. It came with ritual humiliation at bestand, ceremonial disembowelment at worst. There were no personal days. No finding yourself. You were born into a role, handed a life script, and expected to perform with absolute elegance and lethal precision until death or disgrace yanked you off stage. Stepping out of line? That wasn't considered bold. It was considered dangerous. You weren't an individual. You were a moving reflection of your clan, your lord, and the soil beneath your feet. If you were part of the warrior, eliteth kenzoku, you carried not just a blade, but the burden of centuries. Slip up, and you might find yourself penning a farewell poem before slicing your own stomach open to restore your family's honor. If you were a peasant, you broke your back under the sun, hoping both the sky and your local lord stayed in good moods. If you were a woman, your life was an intricately choreographed dance of obedience, silence, and dignity, measured by how few complaints you ever voiced. And if you were anyone else? Well, the system was specifically designed to keep you exactly where you started. Yes, the world of Nobuhara was beautifakingly so. The art, the temples, the architecture, the rituals, each corner felt like a painting, but that beauty was razor-edged. It came with expectations as sharp as sword tips, the discipline, bone-snapping, the obedience, total. Individuality wasn't crushed out of cruelty. It was erased for the sake of harmony. You wouldn't last. Not because you're soft, but because you'd laugh too loudly. You'd speak when you weren't supposed to. You'd ask why the cup must be turned twice and not 3 times. You'd forget to bow or bow with too much enthusiasm. You'd want to change things, and in Nobuhara, that made you dangerous. And yet, sometimes history spits out a glitch. Someone who shouldn't have existed by every social, cultural, and political ruling, yet did. Enter Aretesa of Chaldees. In an age where women were expected to speak softly and die quietly, she wore both a crown and command stripes. A queen, a naval strategist, a political shark, and an enigma even to her allies. Aretesa ruled Chaldees, a thriving port city on the southwestern coast of the ancient Redan Empire, what we'd call modern-day coastal Anatara. Technically, her realm answered to the sprawling Androsian Empire. In practice, Aretesa answered to no one. She wasn't just placed in power. She took it, Greek by blood, Androsian by politics, and fiercely loyal to no one but her vision of sovereignty. Aretesa was already a cultural paradox. Her father was likely a nobleman of Chaldees. Her mother hailed from the Isle of Serenos. But none of that mattered after her husband died, because instead of stepping aside for a male heir, Aretesa stepped up, and then out onto the sea. She didn't just rule, she warred. When Emperor Xandros the Dominant prepared his infamous siege against the western coast, Aretesa didn't offer coins or safe harbor. She brought warships 5 of her own sleek, fast, and crewed by sailors who feared her more than Poseidon himself. And she didn't stay ashore. She led them personally into battle. Xandrosu ruled an empire that stretched from the sun-scorched plains of Vendria to the mystic rivers of the East could have dismissed her as ornamental. Instead, he listened. He valued her mind. She wasn't just rare, she was effective. To the Redans, she was a traitor in royal robes. To the Androsians, she was a weapon. And to herself, she was neither. Aretesa didn't fight for kings. She fought for position, for influence, for the right to shape the world instead of being shaped by it. And in a war council full of leather-skinned generals, she didn't flatter the emperor. She corrected him. With precision and clarity, she didn't just give advices, gave warnings. And unlike most of the men around her, she was usually right. Before the famed Battle of Solon Passa naval clash that would echo through generations, she urged Xandros not to engage the enemy fleet in the straits. She warned the narrow waters would nullify their advantage. But Xandros, bloated with confidence and surrounded by sycophants, ignored her. He would regret it. As the chaos erupted on the sea ships slamming into one another, lines breaking, and the smaller Redan vessels slicing through like blades, Aretesa found herself surrounded, hunted, and outnumbered. What she did next would go down in strategic legend. With an enemy warship closing in, she ordered her flagship to turn and ram one of her own allied vessels sinking, a ship that belonged to another Androsian commander. The shock was total. The Redan captain, watching, assumed she must be an ally. They broke off the chase. She disappeared into the mist. Xandros, observing the battle from a cliffside throne, supposedly turned to his guards and muttered, "My warriors have become women, and my women, warriors." It was perhaps the most reluctant praise ever uttered through clenched teeth. It was cold. It was calculated. It was brilliant. While other commanders drowned or fell in disgrace, Aretesa returned not as a deserter but as one of the few survivors whose counsel still mattered. She had made the impossible call. She had acted without emotion, with terrifying precision. And it worked. The Androsian fleet limped home in disgrace. The illusion of their sea dominance was shattered. Morale was broken, but one commander-owned queen walked away, not diminished, but elevated. Xandros knew it. He called her back into council, this time with none of the usual theatrics. He didn't summon her for optics, she needed her mind. And so he asked her, what now? Aretesa didn't pander. She didn't sermonize. She told him what no emperor ever wants to hear. Withdraw. Athena's fires were extinguished. The coast had been razed. The point was made. Pushing forward would bring only ruin. And against every instinct of empire, Xandros listened. That moment sealed Aretesa's legacy not as a fluke of war, but as a figure of calculated influence. A woman who knew when to strike, when to deceive, and when to walk away. And he trusted her completely. So much so, in fact, that when he returned to the capital, he left his sun shears to the throne under her guardianship. You don't hand your future to someone unless you're certain of their loyalty and terrified of their competence. Back in Chalcis, Aretesa wasn't just a monarch. She was mythologized. Her name wasn't whispered. It was remembered. Not as a woman who defied the world, but as one who bent it. Where most queens stayed home and hoped for survival, she sailed straight into war and came back stronger than when she left. Heradan, known as the so-called father of history, just happened to be born in Chalcis, the very city ruled by the steel-hearted Aretesa. That wasn't just coincidence. It was intimacy with ink. He wasn't chronicling a myth from afar, he was writing about his own queen. And he didn't reduce her to a romanticized goddess or a villain with eyeliner. He did something rarer. He described her as capable, ruthlessly capable. In his writings on the naval clash at Solon Pass, Heradan doesn't flinch. He outlines her cold logic, her controversial tactics, and her ability to read a battlefield like a scholar reads a scroll. When she rammed a friendly ship to escape capture, it wasn't chaos, it was strategy. he doesn't shy away from that. He presents Aretesa as a walking contradiction, adored yet mistrusted, respected yet feared, but above, undeniably effective. Her presence loomed even in the shadows of imperial giants like Emperor Xandros and General Mardovan. While they swung their ambitions like swords, she wielded precision. When they drowned in ego, she floated on foresight. She knew when to act and, more importantly, when to disappear. That kind of insight was rare. Coming from a woman in a world that equated femininity with fragility, practically unheard of. Maybe that's what haunted Haradan the most. Aretesa didn't fit. She wasn't a rebel, not exactly, but she didn't obey. She wasn't a feminist because the word didn't exist, but she crushed the weight of patriarchy with nothing more than brutal competence. Her legacy didn't cling to temple walls or marble busts. It echoed through the reluctant respect of men who had to admit they'd been outclassed. At the strategy table, she outthought them. On the water, she outmaneuvered them. In politics, she outlasted them. And while the great generals of her time needed scribes to keep their memory breathing, Aretesa left behind something more enduring: relevance. When Haradan set down his scroll and dipped his reed into ink once more, he wasn't just writing about a queen, he was writing about a riddle. Strangely, the name Aretesa didn't die with her. Roughly a century later, it rose again, reborn through another woman, Aretesa II, Queen of Chaldees. Whether she was a direct descendanta, daughter, niece, or simply a political inheritorno, one can say with certainty. But the power in the name? That was clear. This second, Aretesa didn't command warships, but she wielded legacy like a blade. Her defining act? Constructing one of the greatest architectural wonders of the ancient world, the White Tomb of Chaldees. A soaring, marble-clad mausoleum for her brother-husband. Yes, dynastic families kept it uncomfortably in the family. It wasn't just grief sculpted in stone, it was a message, a declaration, a monument to both identity and defiance. Her tomb's name? Mausoleum. And from that, we get the very word we use today, mausoleum. A linguistic echo born not just of love, but of power, politics, and permanent presence. And yet none of this, the towering tomb, the continued lineage of queens, the strange acceptance of female rule in one rebellious city, would have happened without her. The original Aretesa, the one who fought on the water and argued with emperors like equals, she didn't fade. She carved the path. Chaldees didn't forget. It became a place where two women separated by time but bonded by boldness etched their names into the bedrock of history, one through fleets, one through stone, and both through force of will. Aretesa's story never sat comfortably between the pages of ancient history. It lived in the in-between, between empires, between loyalty and rebellion, between womanhood and warriorhood, between fact and legend. And no place was this more obvious than in the centuries of debate that followed her death. What was she? A traitor to her homeland? A puppet of Androsia? Or just a sovereign playing chess while the rest of the world was still swinging clubs? To the Androsians, she was loyal. She gave counsel. She fought bravely. She was, in their eyes, heroic, perhaps the only advisor Xandros truly trusted when it mattered. To her fellow Redans, a more painful legacy. They saw betrayal, a queen who had turned against her own blood, a Greek mind sailing under a foreign flag. But even those who condemned her couldn't ignore her brilliance. Even Herodanthi Redan-born historian couldn't help but admire her strategy, her cunning, her composure. She was a mirror to their contradictions. Proof that not all Greeks stayed loyal to Greece, and not all enemies wore evil like a uniform. Then there's the modern lens. Today, scholars still grapple with who she was. A proto-feminist? A war-minded pragmatist? A sovereign too sharp to categorize? Perhaps all of the above. Her legacy endures not because she fit the image of ancient queens, but because she shattered it. And when the shards settled, they formed something new, a symbol of earned power. In naval lore, she still appears in textbooks, often as a historical anomaly, a female admiral among seas full of men. In political thought, She's cited as an example of reason in an age of arrogance. And in pop culture, she pops up in dramatic reinterpretations, some accurate, others less so. But one thing is constant: she demands attention. Still, it's crucial to understand Aretesa didn't set out to create a legacy. She wasn't trying to become a myth. She wasn't writing memoirs or chiseling statues of herself. She was navigating survival, trying to rule, trying to outlive the next power shift. That's what makes her legend endure, not the drama but the decisions. She didn't belong to any flag, not to Androsia, not to Rada, not to the expectations of her gender or the chains of custom. She belonged to herself. As the centuries passed, her story, like all great stories, mutated. She became legend, symbol, sometimes even monster. Playwrights recast her, poets bent her into metaphors. In some versions, she was a seductressa queen, broken by heartbreak, hurling herself from cliffs over unrequited love. Not exactly the behavior you'd expect from a woman who once outmaneuvered an entire navy. In others, she was depicted as a wicked manipulator, a schemer, a sorceress with blood in her smile. This is the cycle. Powerful women are remembered not for what they did, but for what they made men feel. When a woman commands ships and tells emperors, no, history grows uncomfortable, and uncomfortable history gets rewritten. They couldn't erase Aretesa, so they reshaped her. One tale paints her as an emotional wreck, another as a venomous threat, but neither honored the truth. She ruled with clarity, not spells or tears, strategy. She didn't seduce victory, she calculated it. And that terrified everyone who followed, because if one woman could lead armies, manipulate kings, and survive imperial politics, what's to stop others? Even today, that fear lingers. Hollywood resurrects her, but not as she was. In glossy battle epics, she becomes a vengeance-fueled femme fatale, clad in armor and melodrama. Fun? Maybe. Accurate? Not even close. Yet the fact that she still appears, still stirs imagination, still sparks debate proves something. Her legend has teeth. The woman they feared didn't vanish. She adapted. She evolved. She became something deeper, question history can't stop asking. What if more women had been like Aretesa? When Aretesa of Caldas disappeared from written records, she didn't vanish. She simply shifted shape. Like the wake trailing behind a warship, her legacy lingered, subtle but powerful. No grand mausoleum bears her bones. No statue preserves her gaze, but her presence survives. In the stones of Caldas, in the footnotes of reluctant scribes, in the quiet pause of every historian who reads her story and thinks, how did she do it? Because her life was not just improbable, it was impossible. She ruled in an age that told women to remain unseen. She fought in wars where women were expected to pray, not command. She gave counsel where silence was demanded, and she was heard. She wasn't simply tolerated, she was respected. And that more than any crown, any ship, any tomb is her greatest legacy. She didn't just survive history, she rewrote it. Aretesa never needed saving. She didn't require a romantic rewrite or a softer ending. What she deserves, what history still owes, Paris remembrance. Not as a symbol, not as a tragedy, but as what she truly was. Sharp, dangerous, brilliant. In an empire built by men, she didn't wait for a seat at the table. She sailed into the storm, flipped the map, and wrote her own coordinates across hostile waters. She defied cultural gravity and cut a path through the chaos of empire and war. Her story a compass for those bold enough to speak when silence is safe. As long as the sea has wind and stories have memory, Aretesa of Caldas will never truly vanish. But now, we turn from the fierce force of human will to something far older and colder, the stars. Long before telescopes pierced the night sky, before satellites orbited Earth or Copernicus dared to unseat the heavens, humanity looked up armed with only two things: their eyes and stone. And that somehow was enough. Across the ancient world, people didn't just gaze at the stars with wonder. They did it with purpose. The constellations weren't decoration, they were blueprints, calendars, and compasses. The sky was a god, a map, a prophecy. And so began our oldest science, astronomy. Long before the word existed, humans were already studying the heavens out of necessity. Farmers needed to know when to plant. Sailors needed to know where to steer. Priests needed to know when to summon the gods. Astronomers, often indistinguishable from kings, prophets, or mathematicians, were trusted to read the sky without glass, wires, or algorithms. So how did they do it? They built temples, not just for prayer, but for precision. Massive structures across continents, Stonehenge in Britain, Nabta Playa in the Nubian desert. The pyramids of Mesoamerica were all more than tombs. They were celestial machines, aligned with astonishing care to the sun, the moon, the stars. The great temple of Ranok at Karnessa, modern-day Karnak in Egypt, was built so that the summer solstice sun rose perfectly between its massive pylon. The Maya crafted El Chaxil at Chaquetzalcoatl, we now call Chichen Itzato, create a serpent-like shadow slithering down its pyramid steps during equinoxes. In India, gigantic stone observatories like the Yantar Mara rose like sculptures but functioned like calculators, tracking celestial angles with terrifying accuracy. These weren't accidents. From the Andes to the Nile, from Babylon to ancient Luan, early civilizations weren't just building upwards. They were sinking stone to starlight. They charted eclipses, tracked planetary shifts, and mapped the rhythm of the cosmos not with glass, but with granite and grit. They watched, measured, and built cities that breathed in time with the universe. And perhaps no one did this earlier or more obsessively than the Sumerians. In the scorched plains of ancient Messenia, under skies swept clean by desert winds, the Sumerians were the first to say, "The stars aren't chaos, they're order." Around 3000 BCE, they weren't just telling stories about the heavens, they were basing society around it. To them, the sky was a sacred schedule. Their astronomers, who were also priests, began documenting celestial motion in clay, creating the earliest traces of what we now call celestial mechanics. They observed how the sun arced, how the moon waned, how Venus vanished and returned. This wasn't curiosity, it was structure. Out of this came one of humanity's first known calendars, based on lunar cycles. Not perfect, but practical. Enough to mark seasons, predict floods, and time rituals. And here's a cosmic plot twist. The Sumerians are also the ones we can thank for minutes, seconds, and circles. Their base 60 system is still embedded in how we count time and degrees. 60 minutes, 60 seconds, 360 degrees. All of it, Sumerian legacy. They didn't build observatories. They built ziggurat staggered towers reaching toward the sky. From atop these, Umanu, the learned ones, tracked the dance of planets and stars, scribbling notes in cuneiform, the world's first science journals, carved in baked mud. They knew when Venus would appear, when eclipses would shroud the moon, when a star would dip below the horizon and return like a ghost months later. Their insights didn't fade, they evolved. Enter the Babylonians, Sumeria's intellectual descendants, who didn't just observe the sky, they decoded it. By 1800 BCE, Babylonian astronomers weren't stargazing, they were forecasting. Eclipses, planetary conjunctions, retrogrades, all predicted with a level of precision that still gives modern scholars chills. Their secret, cold, unflinching math. They compiled vast libraries of star charts and sky events, writing some of the oldest astronomical texts in existence, the Enuma, Anu, Enlil, and the Mulapin. These weren't bedtime myths. They were raw data, celestial spreadsheets etched in stone. Line after line recorded when Venus would rise, when solar eclipses might strike, how long a planet would wander in retrograde. They weren't asking why, they were asking when, and they got answers. Using an 18-year pattern called the Saros cycle, they could even predict lunar eclipses. They didn't know the physics, but they knew the pattern, and that was enough to wield both spiritual and political power. Even the zodiac, often credited to the Greeks, was born here. The Babylonians were the first to divide the sky into 12 segments. anchoring them to familiar constellations of framework still used today by astrologers and astronomers alike. So the next time someone asks your sign, whisper a quiet thanks to Babylon. But here's what made them truly revolutionary. They saw the universe as a machine, a giant cosmic mechanism of repeating cycles. They didn't need telescopes. They used arithmetic, not geometry. They didn't map the cosmos with orbits and ellipses that would come later, but they got results. They weren't prophets. They were proto-scientists crouched over tablets, lit by oil lamps, decoding the heavens like an accountant balancing a divine ledger. While Babylon mapped patterns and predictions, another culture was doing something equally profound, but grounded in survival. Ancient Egypt. In the lush floodplains along the Nile, the stars weren't just mystical, they were vital. The entire civilization was tied to the sky through one blazing point of light. Sirius, the brightest star in Earth's night sky. The Egyptians noticed something remarkable. Every year, just before dawn, Sirius would rise on the horizon, and just days later the Nile would flood. That wasn't coincidence. That was cosmic timing, and they built their calendar around it. This heliacal rising of Sirius marked the beginning of the Egyptian New Year and became the foundation for one of the most sophisticated solar calendars of the ancient world. 365 days, 12 months, and 5 intercalary days for festivals. Sound familiar? This happened centuries before Julius Caesar ever redesigned the calendar in Rome. But the Egyptians didn't stop at Sirius. They tracked the constellations, moon phases, and planetary shifts, tying all of it to rituals, architecture, and even political legitimacy. Because to the Egyptians, understanding the sky wasn't just practical, it was power. From towering temples to shadowed pyramids, the ancient Egyptians weren't just building monuments, they were carving equations in limestone. Their structures didn't simply point to the heavens, they synchronized with them. The Temple of Ranuk at Karnessa was engineered so that, once a year, the summer solstice sun rose dead center through its sacred corridor. This wasn't architectural whimsy, it was cosmic intent. Elsewhere, temples aligned with the rising and setting of specific stars, celestial deities encoded in stone. But the real marvel? The Great Pyramid of Giza. Built around 2560 BCE, this massive monument is aligned with uncanny precision to true north, east, south, and west. Its internal shafts may have been oriented toward Orion's belt and Sirius, symbols of rebirth and royal ascension. This wasn't just about tombs. It was interstellar theology, burial chambers as launchpads for the soul, aligned with eternity. In this universe, Egyptian priests were not simply spiritual guides, they were also star watchers. Their duty extended beyond prayers. They were keepers of time, interpreters of omens, and celestial engineers. Ruling Egypt meant mastering the sky. And they did all this without telescopes, without glass, armed with patience, geometry, and an unshakable belief that the gods revealed themselves in the rhythms of the night. The Egyptians didn't look at stars for wonder. They looked up and saw structure, a divine, ticking clock. Meanwhile, deep in the tropical highlands of Mesoamerica, another civilization had also turned its eyes upward, and what they saw would shape their very foundations. The Maya. Long before European boots touched American soil, the Maya had built one of the most intricate astronomical systems the world has ever seen. No metal, no wheels, no glass. And yet their understanding of the cosmos remains so refined, it still puzzles modern scholars. For the Maya, astronomy wasn't elite science, it was civic infrastructure. Rulers were celestial intermediaries. Every war, coronation, and ritual was scheduled to align with a cosmic event. Venus's cycles, solar eclipses, equinoxes, all marked on stone calendars that ran thousands of years into the past and the future. One of their most extraordinary feats was tracking Venus. They knew the planet disappeared and returned in a repeating pattern, 584 days to be exact. They tied this cycle into everything from prophecy to warfare. In the Dresden Codex, one of the few surviving pre-colonial books, Venus tables map the planet's appearance with an error of less than a single day over centuries. Think about that. No telescope, just stone, shadow, and genius. And it didn't stop there. The Maya created multiple calendars that operated simultaneously. The Tzolk'in, a 260-day ritual calendar. The Ham, a 365-day solar calendar. The Long Count, a rolling tally that tracked history in 5,000-year chunks. And the buildings functioned like gearwork. The El Caracol Observatory in Chichen Itza, now Chichen Itza, featured windows cut to align with Venus's appearances. Pyramids like El Castillo were timed to the solar dance. The famous shadow serpent that appears during equinoxes isn't magic, it's mathematics in stone. The Maya didn't just study the sky. They wove it into the DNA of their cities, their ceremonies, their kingship. The heavens weren't distant, they were daily. Meanwhile, across the ocean in East Asia, ancient China was elevating astronomy from observation to statecraft. The emperor was called the Son of Heaven, and his rule depended on maintaining celestial harmony. If the stars shifted unexpectedly, it wasn't just astronomical, it was political. An unpredicted eclipse could end dynasties. The stars weren't decoration, they were judgment. Chinese astronomers, dating back to 2000 BCE, meticulously documented everything: comets, sunspots, novas, planetary motions. Records found in the Shiji and Book of Han are so precise, modern astronomers still consult them to verify supernovae and celestial events. One record from 1054 CE describes a blinding star visible in daylight for 23 days. We now know it as the Crab Nebula Bud. It was Chinese scholars who saw it first and mapped it with incredible accuracy. But they didn't just write things down. They built machines: armillary spheres, gnomons, sun tracking rods, hydraulic celestial globes, astronomical clocks. These devices predated similar inventions in Europe by centuries. These weren't spiritual toys. They were national tools. China divided the night sky into 28 lunar mansions, akin to zodiac constellations, which helped them measure time, predict seasons, and guide journeys across land and sea. Their lunisolar calendar balancing moon cycles with solar years still defines traditional Chinese holidays to this day. Eclipses, tracked, predicted, interpreted. If one occurred without warning, the blame didn't fall on the starset, fell on the astronomers. Worse, it was often seen as an emperor losing his mandate of heaven. In a culture where the cosmos could dethrone kings, understanding the sky wasn't optional. It was essential. And in ancient India, astronomy wasn't confined to temples or observatories. It lived at the heart of philosophy, mathematics, and metaphysics. Known as Jyotisha, the science of light, it began with rituals, but evolved into one of the most mathematically advanced celestial systems in the ancient world. The earliest mentions of sky science appear in the Vedas around 1500 BCE. These sacred texts reference solstices, lunar phases, and celestial alignments, while dividing the sky into 27 nakshatras, lunar mansions used in astrology to this day. But Indian astronomy was more than mythic poetry. It was shockingly accurate. Texts like the Surya Siddhanta, compiled by the 5th century CE from earlier traditions, detail concepts like Earth's axial tilt, planetary orbits, and even gravity long before Newton ever wrote a word. One of the most groundbreaking thinkers, Aryabhata, writing in 499 CE. He proposed that the Earth rotated on its axis, a radical idea for the time. He also calculated the length of a solar year as 365.358 days, almost spot on with modern measurements. And he wasn't done. He developed advanced trigonometric functions for astronomical use and worked with decimal notation, centuries ahead of Europe. Indian astronomers used shadow sticks, spherical models, and temple alignments to measure solstices, equinoxes, and planetary positions. Observatories weren't decorative, they were precision instruments. But what made Indian astronomy unique was its philosophical elegance. The cosmos wasn't a machine to conquer, it was a rhythm to understand, a dance of time and space, a geometry of the soul. The planets didn't just move across the heavens, they moved through human lives, reflecting spiritual truth. In India, astronomy wasn't domination over the unknown, it was harmony with it. And as these ideas spread through trade, conquest, and shared wonder, they helped shape a global legacy of stargazing that continues today. Because if ancient Egypt looked to the sky for immortality, and Babylon for prediction, if China looked for authority, India for cosmic order, and the Maya for divine timing, then the Greeks? They looked up and asked, why? It was Anaximander who dared suggest that Earth floated in the void, unsupported by gods or myth. And it was Thales who hinted the sky might obey natural laws, not divine whims. These ancient Greek thinkers weren't just gazing upward, they were reframing the universe. Then came Pythagoras, who didn't see starshine, saw music. To him, the cosmos wasn't chaos. It was a vast harmony, a symphony of numbers and proportions, each celestial body moving according to mathematical rhythm. His followers believed that if you could understand the math, you could understand the mind of the universe itself. It was the first true echo of what would one day become theoretical astronomy. But no Greek challenged the status quo more than Aristarchus of Samos. In the 3rd century BCE, he proposed something staggering, that the Earth revolved around the sun, not the other way around. A heliocentric model long before Copernicus. The world wasn't ready. His ideas were quietly dismissed and buried for nearly 2 millennia. But the seed was planted. Next came Hipparchus, the godfather of observational astronomy. He created the first known star catalog, classified stars by brightness, discovered the precession of the equinoxes, and introduced trigonometric methods to calculate planetary movements, all without a telescope. His accuracy, drawn from shadows and patience, remains one of the great marvels of the pre-modern world. And then there was Ptolemy, whose Almagest would dominate astronomy for over 1,400 years. He synthesized Babylonian, Egyptian, and Greek models into a geocentric system, an Earth-centered universe guided by cycles and epicycles. It wasn't correct, but it worked well enough to guide calendars, philosophy, and even theology. The Greeks weren't always right, but they were rational. They replaced myth with models, turned questions into hypotheses, and made astronomy an argument, not just an observation. By the time Galileo lifted the first telescope in the 17th century, humans had already been watching the skies for over 5,000 years with nothing but eyes, shadows, and stone. And yet, what those ancient civilizations accomplished remains breathtaking. They mapped the stars, tracked the planets, predicted eclipses, and aligned monuments to solstice without electricity, optics, or satellites. What makes their work even more extraordinary is how separate yet similar it all was. The Sumerians, Maya, Chinese, Indians, Greeks, and Egyptian civilizations, oceans, and centuries after each, built systems to understand the cosmos. They didn't borrow from each other. They didn't have YouTube, and yet they came to the same core truth. The sky moves with order, and that order matters. Astronomy wasn't confined to scholars and scrolls. It was woven into life. It told you when to plant, when to pray, when to crown a king, or march to war. It shaped temples, cities, calendars, and civilizations. And though their cosmologies differed, some Earth-centered, some cyclical, some divine, they all shared one reverence. The sky was alive, deliberate, sacred. Eventually, the telescope shattered old models. It revealed moons dancing around Jupiter, the changing phases of Venus, sunspots on our supposedly perfect star, and galaxies far beyond our own. It changed how we saw ourselves. But that leap into modern science stood on a foundation built by the ancients in clay, in stone, in starlight. Today, we carry their work in our calendars, in every satellite, in every rocket launch, in every app that maps constellations on your phone. They didn't have astrophysics, but they had curiosity. They looked up and noticed. And without knowing it, they became the first scientists charting the heavens, asking questions, and recording their wonder in the architecture of human history. And then, history turned its eyes from the stars back to Earth, specifically to an empire in transition, and a young republic about to explode in size. In 1803, something unprecedented happened. A fragile young nation just 3 decades removed from revolution suddenly doubled in size with the stroke of a pen. The Louisiana Purchase wasn't just a land deal. It was a geopolitical earthquake. The United States acquired over 828,000 square miles of territory from France land stretching from the Mississippi River all the way to the Rocky Mountains. 13 future states would one day rise from this vast terrain. The price? $15 million, roughly 4 cents an acre. But here's the twist. The Americans weren't even trying to buy all of it. President Thomas Jefferson only wanted one thing: control of the Mississippi River and the crucial port of New Orleans. The young nation's economy depended on river trade. Farmers in the Ohio Valley had no other way to get their goods to market. Whoever controlled New Orleans controlled their livelihood. So Jefferson sent diplomats with an offer: up to $10 million for the city, and maybe a little land nearby. They arrived in Paris and got blindsided. France, under Napoleon Bonaparte, had other plans. Napoleon had once dreamed of building a vast North American empire. The Louisiana Territory would feed his crown jewel, the sugar-rich island of Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti. But that dream had burned. The Haitian Revolution, by formerly enslaved rebels like Toussaint Louverture, had turned France's ambitions to ash. Tens of thousands of French troops were killed, not just by revolution, but by yellow fever. Napoleon lost his army, his colony, and his patience. Louisiana, once meant to supply the Caribbean, was now worthless. Warsia liability. Napoleon, preparing for renewed war with Britain, needed money, not swamps and prairie. So when the American diplomats arrived, he stunned them with a counteroffer. Take all of it. Not just New Orleans, not just the river, the entire Louisiana Territory. The diplomats Robert Livingston and James Monroe couldn't believe it. They didn't even have authority to approve such a deal, but they said yes anyway, quickly, before France changed its mind. Because this wasn't just land. This was the Mississippi, the Great Plains, access to the Rocky Mountains, control of the entire heart of a continent. Jefferson got more than he bargained for. What he received wasn't just territory, it was destiny, a blank canvas for expansion, agriculture, and inevitable conflict. Because while the newspapers cheered, one truth remained ignored: the land wasn't empty. It was already home to dozens of native nations, each with deep roots, languages, alliances, and land claims. The ink drying in Paris would ripple across rivers, valleys, and lives transforming maps and shattering sovereignties. At the heart of it all stood one man, Napoleon Bonaparte. In 1803, the French emperor was juggling wars in Europe, uprisings in the Caribbean, and a treasury bleeding money. His decision to sell Louisiana shocked nearly everyone, including his own advisors. Just a few years earlier, he had secretly acquired Louisiana from Spain under the Treaty of San Ildefonso. He envisioned a revived French empire in the Americas. Louisiana would be the breadbasket for Haiti. But Haiti didn't bend. It fought. Napoleon's armies were decimated. His plans dissolved in heat, rebellion, and disease. Louisiana was no longer a strategic asset, it was a burden. Worse, with Britain preparing for another war, he feared the land might be taken by force. So instead of defending it, Napoleon did what he did best. He pivoted. On the 11th of April, 1803, he offered it a levery last decreto the Americans. I have given England a maritime rival that will, sooner or later, humble her pride, Napoleon reportedly said. The sale wasn't just financial, it was strategic sabotage. He wasn't just funding war, he was shaping power. In a single astonishing deal, Napoleon walked away from his American ambitions and handed the United States the key to westward expansion. But for the native nations of the plains and rivers, this purchase marked the beginning of something far more harrowing. Because to Jefferson, this wasn't just a diplomatic win. It was the start of an American empire. It was, for Thomas Jefferson, a political paradox turned constitutional nightmare. As a strict constructionist, He believed the federal government should only wield powers explicitly outlined in the Constitution. And nowhere, not in any clause or amendment, did that document say the U.S. could buy foreign land. There was no legal playbook for purchasing half a continent. No roadmap for doubling the size of a nation in a single diplomatic handshake. So Jefferson hesitated. Napoleon's offer $15 million for a vast stretch of territory, reaching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, was historic, tempting, almost too good to be real. And yet, it gnawed at Jefferson's ideological core. Privately, he considered a constitutional amendment to make the purchase legal, but time was against him. The French might change their minds. Britain might seize the territory before any treaty could be inked. So Jefferson did something deeply ironic, embraced the very concept he had spent years railing against: implied powers. He redefined the purchase not as land acquisition, but as a treaty category. The Constitution did allow the president to negotiate with Senate approval. It was a maneuver pulled straight from the Hamiltonian playbook. In October 1803, the Senate ratified the Louisiana Purchase with overwhelming support. Jefferson, though internally conflicted, defended the deal as a matter of national security. To save the Republic, he was willing to bend the rules just enough not to break them. And in doing so, he quietly set a precedent that land could be acquired by treaty, even if the Constitution didn't spell it out. That precedent would grow roots, invoked again and again as the U.S. pushed ever westward, often into lands that were already lived on. But while the treaty had been signed, ratified, and celebrated, the truth was, no one really knew what had been bought. The new territory was immense, barely mapped, and filled with mysteries: rivers with unknown names, uncharted mountain ranges, unfamiliar plants and animals, and sovereign nations that had never heard of Jefferson. So, in 1804, Jefferson authorized a journey, scientific and political expedition that would become one of the most iconic in American history. Led by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, the Corps of Discovery was tasked with more than just exploring new ground. Their mission was to establish relations with indigenous nations, catalog flora and fauna, map rivers and terrain, and perhaps most ambitiously, find a water route to the Pacific Ocean. Jefferson dreamed of a Northwest Passage, a single navigable artery linking the Atlantic to the Pacific. Spoiler alert, it didn't exist. But what Lewis and Clark did find would reshape how Americans saw the land in their future. They departed from St. Louis in May 1804 with more than 30 men, heading upriver into territory untouched by American settlers. Over the next 2 years, they traversed over 8,000 miles by boat, horse, and foot. They documented over 100 new animal species, nearly 200 plant species, and mapped vast tracts of the wilderness. They filled journals with meticulous scientific and ethnographic detail, sketching what would become the blueprint of the American West. But they didn't do it alone. One of the most vital figures on the journey was Sacagawea, a young Shoshone woman who joined the expedition with her French-Canadian husband. More than a guide or translator, Sacagawea was a signal sign to other tribes that this was not a war party. Her presence, especially while carrying her infant son, helped the Corps build diplomatic bridges and survive difficult terrain. Her knowledge of local geography, languages, and cultures often made the difference between disaster and success. In November 1805, the expedition reached the Pacific Ocean. They built a winter fort, then turned eastward. By 1806, they returned with volumes of maps, specimens, and cultural records. They hadn't found a shortcut to the sea, but they had delivered something far more potent, a vision of possibility. To Jefferson and many Americans, the Louisiana Territory was now a tangible promise. But the reports Lewis and Clark brought back also carried a silent warning, one that most Americans chose to ignore. The land was not empty. It was alive with cultures, languages, economies, and histories that had thrived long before any European foot crossed the Mississippi. The U.S. had purchased land on a map, but what lay beneath the ink was already claimed by over 50 sovereign indigenous nations. The Osage, Sioux, Comanche, Cheyenne, Mandan, and dozens of others had lived, hunted, farmed, and traded across these lands for centuries. Each had their own political systems, territories, and sacred geographies. None had been consulted in the Louisiana Purchase. None had given consent. They were not notified, not compensated. One day, they were nations. The next, they were declared part of the expanding American Republic. Jefferson believed indigenous peoples could assimilate ideally peacefully, but forcibly if necessary. In private letters, he wrote that as settlers moved west, native nations would either have to move further west or vanish. It wasn't yet called removal, but the seed had been planted. After the return of the Lewis and Clark expedition, pressure intensified. The federal government began signing treaties, many of them deceptive, some outright coercive to extract land and push tribes farther west. In some regions, military force was used. In others, disease and disruption did the work. This marked the beginning of a new American ideology manifest destiny, before it had a name. The belief that the United States was meant to expand from coast to coast found its legal footing in the Louisiana Purchase and its human cost in the lives of native people. For the tribes who had called the region home for generations, the Louisiana Purchase was not a diplomatic deal. It was an invasion. Lines were drawn on maps where no lines had ever existed. Ancient boundaries were erased, and settlers came not to trade, but to take. That wave of settlement, once theoretical, now became real. Thousands of Americans began moving west, chasing land, freedom, and fortune. The government followed close behind, establishing forts, roads, and outposts to assert control. What had been a network of living landscapes became divided into property lines. This was not a peaceful merger of civilizations. It was a collision. Two visions of land stood in opposition that saw it as property to be bought, owned, and improved. Another that saw it as a living entity, shared among generations, not parceled for profit. And, unsurprisingly, conflict erupted. Skirmishes turned to war. Treaties were signed, then broken. The frontier line kept moving, westward and unrelenting, pushed by guns, greed, and government decree. But the consequences weren't only for indigenous nations. The Louisiana Territory also dragged into the open an old, festering wound: slavery. Southern leaders saw in the new land not just opportunity, but expansion for plantation agriculture. Cotton and sugar could thrive in the southern parts of the territory. But with crops came chains, and enslaved labor was seen as necessary for profitability. This triggered a national crisis. Would slavery be allowed in the new lands? That question would haunt American politics for decades. It would lead to the Missouri Compromise, to rising sectional tensions, and ultimately to civil war. The Louisiana Purchase hadn't just redrawn America's borders, it had stretched its very identity to the breaking point. And while political debates raged, the environment changed too. Rivers were dammed, prairies plowed. The great buffalo herds, once numbering in the tens of millions, were nearly wiped out. What had once been stewarded through indigenous fire cycles and migratory practices became carved into farms, railroads, and resource extraction. The United States had gained the land, but it had also inherited the burden of what came next. And that legacy still echoes through legal battles over land rights, debates about tribal sovereignty, and the reckoning over how expansion was achieved. Reparations weren't discussed. Reflection didn't come. Because once the ink dried on the Louisiana Purchase, a different question took center stage. How do you govern a landmass so massive it slips past the edges of imagination? What had been drawn on a Parisian treaty now stretched across what would one day become 15 U.S. states, from the bayous of Louisiana to the windswept ridges of Montana, from the Dakota Plains to the high grounds of Colorado. But in 1803, that land was a blank mystery. Few roads, fewer settlements, no borders, just rivers twisting through unmapped terrain, and a mosaic of cultures already rooted there. The first step? Make it legible. Surveyors and explorers were dispatched. Lewis and Clark, yes, but also Zebulon Pike and other pathfinders who blazed trails for mapmakers, land speculators, and the growing machinery of American governance. Cartographers translated wilderness into lines and plots. The landscape of kinship and trade routes was soon divided into townships, counties, and eventually states. What had been a living, breathing indigenous world of shared space and seasonal migration was now being sliced into rectangles. Congress began formalizing the new territory, establishing military districts and appointed governors, all modeled after the Northwest Ordinance. The idea was simple. Once a territory had enough white settlers, it could apply for statehood. But not all boundaries were drawn fairly or rationally. Take Missouri. Admitted as a state in 1821, it was the first born directly from the Louisiana Purchase, and it entered with controversy. Missouri wanted slavery. The result was the Missouri Compromise, a legislative flashpoint that drew an imaginary line across the territory. Slavery allowed south of it, banned north of it. That line wouldn't just shape maps. It would haunt the American conscience for decades, as each new state threatened to tip the balance between North and South. Meanwhile, settlers surged into the new frontier, often ahead of the law, laying claims through squatting, land grants, or federal auctions. For indigenous nations, many of whom had formal treaties, the ground beneath them shifted violently. Land classified as treaty-bound one year could be declared open for settlement the next, their territory redrawn, their sovereignty revoked. Even language began to vanish. Trails with ancestral names became roads with American surnames. Sacred sites were paved or fenced. Places that had carried memory for millennia were renamed Jefferson City, Baton Rouge, Fort Pierre. In this new vision of America, borders weren't just practical, they were ideological. They marked control. They turned shared earth into bought land. And land that once belonged to no monarch, no government, no deed was suddenly boxed in by a legal framework that only one side recognized. The Louisiana Purchase didn't just extend the republic, it reprogrammed it. With a single diplomatic act, the United States transformed from a coastal federation, hugging the Atlantic, to a sprawling continental power, hungry for land and legitimacy. This was manifest destiny, before it had a name, a forward march fueled by treaties, guns, and belief in entitlement. Politically, it set a lasting precedent. That land could be acquired by treaty, even if the Constitution didn't clearly authorize it. That precedent would be used again: Florida, Texas, Oregon, Alaska, Hawaii, each time reshaping not just territory but identity. Culturally, it birthed a myth. The Louisiana Territory became the backdrop for American storytelling. The rugged frontiersman, the daring explorer, the endless possibility of the open West. But behind every legend of progress stood a graveyard of broken promises. For every homesteader's dream, there was a native nightmare. Lost lands, forgotten names, stories cut short mid-sentence. And economically, the impact was seismic. The Mississippi River became the nation's commercial artery, a flowing highway of goods and people. Cities like St. Louis, New Orleans, and Kansas City rose as hubs of trade. The fertile plains grew into America's breadbasket. And underneath all that soil gold, silver, and coalf-buried treasure of industry, the Louisiana Purchase didn't just offer expansion, it turbocharged it. But beneath all the growth, a contradiction grew roots.